My name is Jonathan Ryder, and I'm the director here at the Flag Art Foundation. Tonight's conversation will feature artist Jesse Mockrin and author, essayist, and critic Carmen Machado. I want to thank you both for participating tonight and just being a part of the broader scope of the Spotlight program. This series, the Spotlight series, encompasses the presentation of a new or never before seen artwork paired with a commissioned piece of writing. Jesse's is the 24th in the series since the program began in 2022, and will be followed by a new piece by Peter Halley and a text by poet Elaine Equi, which will open next Wednesday, May 21st. Tonight's conversation will dance around 45 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Before I dive into the talk, I'd like to thank my colleagues Caroline and Madeline for their help in organizing the series and the event, as well as Sasha Feldman and David Noor eventually, from James Cohan Gallery for their constant support. And with that, I'd also like to take a moment to introduce my very accomplished guest this evening. Jesse Mockrin is an artist living and working in Philadelphia. Mockrin earned her BA at Barnard College, Columbia University in 2003, and her MFA at the University of California at San Diego in 2011. Recent solo exhibitions include The Venus Effect at James Cohan Gallery in 2023, Secession at the Center of International Contemporary Art in Vancouver in 2023, Reliquary at Night Gallery in Los Angeles in 2022, among many others. Mockrin's work is included in numerous public collections, including the Art Gallery of Ontario, which will host her first solo show in September of 2025, the Art Institute of Chicago, LACMA, the Rebel Collection, and the Zhao Museum in Rizhou, China. Mockrin's numerous oil paintings extract details from European old master paintings, reformulating and recontextualizing cultural narratives and art historical motifs to speak to the present moment. Carmen Machado is the author of the best-selling memoir In the Dream House, published in 2019, the graphic novel The Low, Low Woods, published in 2020, and the award-winning short story collection Her Body and Other Parties, published in 2017. Machado has been the finalist for the National Book Award and the winner of the Bard Fiction Prize, the Lambda Literary Award for Lesbian Fiction, the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ Nonfiction, and the Brooklyn Public Library Literature Prize, among many others. Her work, essays, poetry, and criticism has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Vogue, This American Life, Harper's Bazaar, and many others. She's been awarded fellowships and residencies from Yaddo, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, Hedgebrook, the Millard Colony of the Arts, and she is currently a visiting professor of Iowa Writers Workshop. Before we begin the conversation, I would really like to invite Carmen to read her essay that she wrote specifically for Jesse's Spotlight presentation. So I'll hand this over to you.
Great, thank you.
Of course.
So this is called It Seemed to Him. 1. Fires too subtle for my thought. Here she is, as she always is, Daphne, daughter, virgin, first beloved, stumbling into the path of Phoebus. Phoebus proud, Phoebus great, Phoebus who wronged Cupid, vengeful Cupid, undaunted Cupid, impish Cupid, Cupid with 2 arrows, dull, lead, repelling love, sharp, gold, exciting love. It could have been otherwise. It could have been daughter and virgin and first beloved, incandescent with want. Daphne, as we see her, spreading for heaven, leaping from peak to peak for a taste of what thrilled her, the pierce of radiance, the touch of the god of poetry, of dance, the touch of the god of glorious light. But no, lead to Daphne, lovely, gold to the god of contempt. 2, the joys of chase. Daphne did not need a reason, but Cupid gave her one. She longs to stay a virgin, one who denies the joys of love. She begs her father to allow her modesty. Dearest father, she says, let me live, so much to do, so much to do, a list as long as a tree is tall and it grows by the hour. Like so many daughters, she would rather live than love. Like so many fathers, he promises what he cannot give, because her beauty prevails against her will. What do we call it? What do we call it? As the stubble of the field flares, tisk tisk, it happens, and the stacked wheat is consumed by flames, every day it seems, so the bosom of Phoebus is consumed. He is consumed, but he still has notes. Her hair would be perfect if it was properly arranged. He didn't need the arrow, but it's how the story will go. The god of light calls to the living virgin Daphne. He tells her to calm down. Yes, the lamb leaps from the raging wolf. Sure, the lion runs from the timid fawn. Of course, the prey flees from their natural enemy. But not now, not this time. Daphne, beloved, why do you run? 3, she seemed most lovely. Her flight made her beautiful. Zephyr stirred her garments. The wind caressed her hair. He is greyhound. He is mad with love. He rushes, she flees, he gains. He follows and permits her no rest. Spent, she cries out for her father, useless, and her mother, better. She offers up her body and her beauty, no prison worse than his desire, anything to be free. Fathers have a way of misunderstanding what mothers do not. We are close to her now. She wants us to see, to know. Bark crawls down her arms, her torso, her thighs like gauntlets, like armor, like silk. She suffers in triplicate. Branches sprout from her fingers. She twists and writhes and spirals. She sees him. She looks at us. Her hair becomes as leaves. So literal, Father. So correct, and yet so utterly, perfectly wrong. Rooted, she takes her first and final breath. It seemed to him. Any man can love a tree. She is still slender, has knots and clefts, and lost her imperious mouth. His hand lingers on her trunk chest. How many times in her life? Too many to number. He clings to her branch arms like twine every day at least. Her bosom bark throbs with what depends on the teller. He puts his mouth to the wood of her. Does she shrink from every kiss, or is it the breeze that stirs her? Phoebus always did love a monologue. He always adored having the last word. And then, I don't know how to read this because it's 2 parallel columns, but the first one for Phoebus is, tree bride, nymphette of the forest, chosen mine, you can no longer speak, so I will speak for you. You cannot give me your body, and so I will take it in honor of your honor. I will strip your leaves and wear them on my brow. I will wreathe you around my quiver and my lyre, and I will remain ever young. And as I will remain ever young, your leaves will never leave, and you will belong to men if there are men. See, she's nodding. As a girl, she had imagined the fullness of love. She had spoken endless, unbroken verse into the gloaming or twilight or dusk. She had stripped herself and wore herself and beheld herself. She loved her hair, the color of wheat or soil or blood or pitch. She had been so good with a bow. She would sing to the birds, to the water, to her mother. She was her own and only. It is, of course, only the wind. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think when we first talked about the project, and then it became kind of Apollo and Daphne and the story behind it, it's something that we all, I think, kind of know in the back of our minds, but the details are something that it was interesting to go back and actually read the story again. So I think to ground the conversation, I just kind of want to go over the story just really quickly. So in Greek mythology, Apollo, who was the god of reason, music, and poetry, mocked Eros, who was the god of love. And in retaliation, Eros fired 2 arrows, a golden arrow causing Apollo to fall in love with the first person he saw, and a lead-tipped arrow causing Daphne, a water nymph, the first person he saw, to be impervious to love. Under the spell of Eros' arrows, Apollo pursued Daphne, who in turn continued to reject him. As Daphne ran from Apollo, she called out to her father, the river god Peneus, who upon hearing her cries for help transformed her into a laurel tree. Apollo claimed that he would love Daphne forever, and in doing so, he basically mourned her at the foot of the tree, which is recounted in Ovid's Metamorphosis, which essentially says, fairest of maidens, you are lost to me, but at least you shall be my tree forever. So even in another form, she can't escape him, which then kind of opened up this other book to thinking about kind of the history of also kind of biblical saints, who also have to kind of transform to evade kind of men's pursuits. 2 came to mind immediately, although the second one is, I think, much more common. The first one is Saint Wigglesfortis, who's a Portuguese saint known for her large beard. characteristic stemming from a legend where she prayed to be made so repulsive to avoid unwanted marriage that she grew a beard. So now she's the patron saint of women seeking refuge from abusive relationship and the patron saint of facial hair, which is kind of a combination.
I love her. I love that you brought her up. She's one of my favorite saints.
It's a fascinating saint coin if you ever see it as well.
Yeah, but there are like places where there's just like, people get confused because it's like a figure with breasts who has like this really big beard.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
And then the second one that came to mind, similarly in that vein, was Saint Agatha of Sicily, who was often depicted with her breast severed on a plate. Agatha was a virgin martyr who, according to legend, had to cut off her breasts as a form of torture to refuse to marry a Roman official. So there's the implication in all these narratives, from Daphne Apollo to Bogofortis to Agatha of Sicily, that women have to transform themselves, disguise themselves, possibly hurt themselves to protect themselves, body and mind, from men's advances. And in your essay, you write, of course, the prey flees their natural enemy. So I think to kind of start the conversation off with the subject matter at hand, why is the theme perpetually evergreen, and how do you take an evergreen theme such as this and kind of recontextualize it in a painting or in a piece of poetry for a painting?
Do you want to start? Since the painting came first.
Well, in my practice in general, I'm always looking at European art history for inspiration. The practice really focuses on reenacting and re-enlivening these works from the past to talk about their contemporary resonance in this moment. And so I think the actual practical methods are through cropping, reframing the black background that isolates the original context of the work. And in this case, I created 3 of them, thinking about the 3 graces and a nod to that. And also because I'm interested in the way these themes are so frequently repeated in art history. So there are so many versions of Daphne. And in fact, this painting references one that's an engraving, one that's a sculpture, and one that's a painting. So when I transform it all into painting, they can all be equal, right, and exist in the same plane. And then their arms are almost as if they're like linked, but can't reach each other. So thinking about how, if there had not been one Daphne, but friends there with her, how women could have together supported each other in that moment, and instead they're kind of prevented from working together or, protecting each other.
Fascinating.
So then I had the chance to obviously see the painting and hear about it, and then revisit the metamorphosis and just look through the text itself. And I feel like when I do a lot of work like this, I definitely write, I've rewritten or adapted a lot of fairy tales, urban legends. I've always been really interested in stories of the oral tradition, myths, legends, things like that. It was funny because I was like, okay, I was thinking about what am I gonna do with this material? And you couldn't hear it obviously when I was reading, but if you were looking at the paper, you know that there's certain parts that are in italics, and that's actually from the metamorphosis. So I was kind of taking, sort of selectively pulling out. I feel like this was closer to poetry than I do write poetry, but I would say I'm more of a fiction writer or essayist, but it did feel like I was sort of taking these sort of individual elements from the story and trying to just move them around and just slightly contextualize them in a way that makes the themes, the subtext of the story text. Because I think with a lot of these stories, the word rape does not appear. There's the actual what is being described in this story, which is a woman running for her life, and this man who will not stop pursuing her, which is why there's the line what do we call it? What do we call it? Because those stories will often have fairy tales are like this too. Fairy tales will have these very one that I always think about is the golden ball, which is the one where the princess drops her golden ball down a well, and a frog gets it for her, but he's like, I'll get you your ball if you promise to let me sit next to you at the table and sleep in your bed with you. And she's like, okay. And then she gets home and she's like, I've changed my mind. I do not want you to sit next to my plate or sleep in my bed with me. And her father's like, you made a promise. can't go back on it. And so she just has to like eat with this like horrible frog sitting next to her plate, and then he sleeps in her bed with her. And the first time I ever heard that story, I was like, that is like the rapiest story I've ever heard in my entire life. It's just about like, you can't withdraw consent, you can't like say, I don't want this, your father will make you follow through on your word, etc. And so I think in my practice, I'm oftentimes like looking at stories that I've heard a million times and just like not even doing that much. I feel like it's just kind of like shaking it a little bit and kind of seeing like what kind of emerges out of it, and then trying in some way to like, again, like recontextualize it. So I guess it's like my equivalent of like zooming in or recropping. But like if I frame this slightly differently, how might the way that I see this story be more evident to the reader? Because I feel like I guess this is similar to painting, but it's like, I feel like my job is to be like, taking people's faces and being like, do you see what I see? Like, do you understand what I'm looking at? And I guess that is kind of like what painting, yes. Right? And so, but it's for me, it's like with words, I guess. But yeah, and so I think that for me, that's why that work is so interesting to me. And so I feel like with this story, I didn't have to do even that. Like I was like, am I gonna write a content? I didn't know what I was gonna do, and then it was just like so clear that all I had to do was just like shape it and like put it on a black background and zoom in real close and, do all the things, metaphorically speaking, that you were also doing in the painting.
I love that so much because it's a really close parallel to the way that I work in images, and also like your use of the direct quotes, like, and these broken fragments just felt like so perfect for a metaphor for the painting too.
Yeah, and I think also because you were talking about like obviously the fact that it's like a triptych, that it has this like 3-part structure. I was also thinking about that. I mean, I ended up doing 4 sections, not 3.
With the breaks.
I tried to do 3. I was like, oh, that'll be perfect, but it didn't work, and it felt like it was 4. But then at the end, when I had like the 2 parallel sections where it's like him saying what he thinks the story is about, and then what she thinks the story is about, and they're running side by side, that to me felt like also like the beauty of like poetry, which sort of, uses white space and uses sort of the way text is sort of on the page visually to create like certain effects, which is a little different than like fiction. It just felt like, it was exactly the right way to like, to like think about it again. It's like in the idea of like the 2 stories like next to each other. Just
you made your own diptych.
Exactly. I actually also thought about doing 3. Like I had all these ways. I was like, okay, I'll do exactly what I'll do. I'll do a triptych. I was like, I'll do a whole. But then I think it turned out good. It wasn't what I was imagining at the beginning. But I did like play with the like little column function on my Word software for like a while.
But it's interesting to think about whether it's mythology or poetry or even kind of the children's fairy tales. It's kind of a reduced space where you're taking incredibly high-pitched moments of human terror or fear, and you're reducing it to a space where I think the audience, I don't want to say is ambivalent about it, but is less acutely aware of it because it's a framing device through the writer. So I think it's interesting to talk about kind of horror in the realm of kind of imagery and text, because essentially we're talking about, what would be a rape scene. But she turns into a tree, she escapes beforehand. So, I think it's interesting to kind of like use the approach of, I don't want to say like looking at the old masters, but also like mannerism. Like where it's a human body, but it's not quite a human body. Where the hands have slightly too many bones and kind of flick out at the end. Or it's kind of like, I think it's like the idea of like, what can you build into a painting? And how do you kind of think about that? And I would also say, like, how can you build that into a text as well? Kind of elements of horror.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this being a kind of body horror because, she escapes him, but she does so by losing her human identity and transforming into a tree. And when I had to paint it, I was like, oh God, this could be really creepy, And I think part of my desire to paint it is to inhabit the story and to make it accessible to people in a more visceral way,
sure,
in a more contemporary way. And so, I had at one point just like kind of scales of tree bark climbing down her arm, and I was like, this is too much like the lizard in Spider-Man or something. Like it has to be the right amount that's not so off-putting that you can contemplate it. I think about that framing device when we see art historical works in the museum, and how they just feel like they're at home within their context, and the horror and the sexual violations of the stories kind of fade into the background.
Well, I feel like every time people talk about Bernini's statue, everyone talks about kind of his use of marble and the idea of like the making of the skin. No one talks about the actual scene. They talk about kind of the talent of the maker.
The technique.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think also, there's this essay that I love that I also teach a lot by Kate Bernheimer, who's this like fairy tale scholar and writer. And she talks about the form of the fairy tale, like what makes a fairy tale, and she identifies 4 main components of the form. And one of them is naturalized magic, which is basically that like stuff is happening that we don't really question, like in terms of like realism. But then also there's one she calls it flatness, where basically the story is sort of lacking like psychological depth, but it's intentional. And she describes it as a literary effect that creates a depth of response in the reader. So when you read fairy tales, she's like, nobody in fairy tales are like neurotic from what has happened to them. Like they're not, like there's like not a lot of like, people might be like upset or sad, but they mostly just like react and they just sort of do things. And so I think that a lot of times when we adapt things that have this kind of flatness, like myth, anything that has that sort of like, well, here's a story about one time this thing happened, and you don't really get a really acute sense of like the psychological sort of dimensions of it. But that's why like retellings are so interesting. So like Angela Carter, who's like a writer who does a lot of reinventions of fairy tales, will just take these very simple stories and just create these like endless, like blood red depths that are like underneath the stories. So it's again taking that reader response that's sort of understood in like the traditional form of it, and then actually like peeling it back and being like, okay, so if we're imagining this actually is happening, what is it like? And I think that's also right. It's like we're not just like talking about her becoming a tree. It's like we're gonna watch like the bark like crawl down her skin, or we're gonna like just again bring that like implied violence up to the surface where it belongs.
It's also interesting to think about like fairy tales as being taught to children, or mythology also is taught in kind of classrooms. And I think what's also like, this is going to seem like a slight divergence, but it's going to get back to the center. So just like hold on with me. I'm from Easton, Pennsylvania.
Oh, okay.
We're about 20 minutes away from each other. You're from Allentown, and you live about an hour and 15 south right now in Philadelphia.
Eastern PA.
Yeah. So I kind of like to talk about beginnings, because I also think it's like, my parents were both educators, first of their families to go to college, raised incredibly creative kids, but weren't fans of their kids becoming creatives. So I'm fascinated by also just kind of these beginning stories about like when you felt creativity was a path you could walk down. Eastern Pennsylvania is a specific place, but maybe it's not. I mean, Maryland's not that far away. But I'm interested in terms of kind of when a creative path seemed like the decision or that's the place to run towards. Like I'm interested in just like Genesis stories involved over here.
So my father is a chemical engineer, and my mother is a homemaker, and I have wanted to be a writer since I could talk. Like I feel like it's been my destiny, for lack of a better word, since I was a child. And like, it's funny because my parents, like, reading was really important in our households, even though my parents themselves are not huge, and they do read, but like they're not like the kind of reader that like me or my siblings are, but they read to us. My great-grandmother read to me, there was just people reading to us constantly. And so as soon as I could like hold a pen, I was like making weird little books, and I would steal my father's stationery, and I would make a book with like I'd staple like pages, and I wrote this book when I was like 5 or 6 called The Biggest Turkey Can't Find the Farm. And it's about a turkey who's lost. And there's like a wanted poster with his face on it, and he's going to all these different places, and he's like, is this the farm? And it's like a hotel and like a zoo. He's like, no, it's not here. And at the very end, he finds the farm, and he's like, yes. And then the final page is him roasted on a platter. And the last line is, I wish I did not come here. And my mother was like, And I mean, and I don't think I I think I was reading a lot of like Shel Silverstein and Roald Dahl and like those sort of very dark sort of children's authors. So I think I was primed for like a weird, ironic, dark turn at the end of like the book that I had written about the turkey who gets killed. And so I think I was just always like pointed in that direction. And it's funny because I actually like have done other things and had other ambitions. Like I read so many medical novels that I was like, I'll be a doctor. And then I hated math. And I was like, well, I don't think I could be a doctor if I don't like math. For a while, I was like, I'm going to be a pediatric oncologist because it was like the most impressive like phrase that I could think of. And then I was like, no, I don't want to do that. And like in college, I actually studied photography. Like I have a visual arts background. But I was like fine at photography. I'm good. I'm decent at photography. But like it was even when I had majored in that, because I panicked and switched my majors like 12 times, and they were like, you have to pick a major so you can graduate. And I was like, okay. But like I just kept like reorienting towards it. And it was funny because my parents were very stressed out. My dad was like, you know, you need to have health insurance. You need to like make a living. And so he actually talked me into going to school for journalism, which is why I switched majors 12 times because I took like one semester of journalism classes and I was like, absolutely not. And so it was really interesting sort of watching that tension of like the parents being like, you have to find something responsible, you have to like figure out how to support yourself. And me being, you know, I've worked like a job in like every profession you can possibly imagine. But just being like, I do think this is like the thing, like this sort of way of seeing the world. Like I think in images, in like images as sentences, like I wake up with like fragments in my brain, like fragments of language. I like catch them. It's very like metaphysical. I don't know. It's like where it's like yeah, my subconscious is just like oriented towards a creative practice, and like I can try anything out in the world, but like I really want to be a writer, which made my dad insane. He was like, he was very concerned, but I figured it out. So here I am now.
Thanks for being here.
Yeah.
I was also very interested in drawing from when I was small. I remember going to doctor's appointments with my mom or something, and I would have a yellow legal pad, and she would always have like 5 different colored pens in her purse, and I would draw mostly faces. So I always liked drawing. I was a creative kid. I was not an athletic kid. And then my parents were also both scientists. So my dad worked at NIH, and my mom worked at EPA. And my sister has gone on to also like get a PhD in the sciences and work for the federal government. So I'm like the only artsy one in the bunch. And then I had a wonderful high school teacher at my public high school who introduced us to oil painting and told me about classes I could take at a nearby summer program. And I got really into it. And I was this like 15 to 18-year-old just painting on the weekends and painting pictures of my friends. It was always people. With this other teacher, we would do these plein air exercises where we would go to the National Cathedral or to the streets of Bethesda, Maryland, and paint with our little easels. And I was just always painting the other kids in the class. Like I was like, I see nothing in this landscape. I have no idea.
And just documenting the class.
Yeah. I was like orienting towards people. At one painting, it was just like my legs, like near the National Cathedral, but not the cathedral. So that was really great, and my parents were always just cautious, like, you know, that doesn't really seem like a career that normal people
the health insurance question
to have. But they, you know, they didn't push me any direction. And I studied art and art history as an undergrad at Barnard, and I did a lot of photography there. I actually deviated away from painting for a while, and I was in Honduras for 2 years. I started a nonprofit organization there with some friends, and we were teaching art to orphaned and abandoned youth. And I thought maybe that's what I wanted to do, was like art with international development. And I applied to get my master's in international development at Columbia, and I also applied to MFA programs.
Yeah.
And then MFA programs, when I went to UCSD, it was funded. And I was like, well, that seems like a better gamble.
A paid education.
Yeah, a free time to spend 3 years in a studio and study. And so that's what I did, and haven't really looked back. And my stepmom regularly is like, you won the lotto. It's very sweet.
What did you like shooting with? What was your favorite kind of photography?
I had a Mamiya 7.
Ooh.
Medium format film camera.
Yeah, I was also I was a real medium format. I mostly have sold all my, I got rid of a lot of my stuff years ago, but I do still have my Holga. And it's really cool to like, I don't know, medium format always seemed like a really nice.
The sweet spot?
Yeah, it always seemed like the sweet spot. Yeah, I don't know.
When did though, I mean, from like Caravaggio to George Delatorre to Titian, like when did kind of the focus on the masters come in? Or the focus on kind of like a certain kind of late Renaissance kind of space? Because it's kind of, it's both very specific, but also like the storytelling is endless. So I mean, yeah.
Well, I did study art history at Barnard. You could not major in visual arts, you could only minor in it if you majored in art history. So I had that background, and then when I went to UC San Diego, I had to start working in the studio immediately, and I turned back to painting, which I hadn't really done since college, and I got really obsessed with oil painting, the technique, the history of it. I had not really had, other than my plein air activities, like a formal painting education like you would get at an art academy or something like that. So I was trying to teach myself these historical techniques and learn about it, which led to looking at a lot of historical painting. And my work through graduate school was really rooted in the photography that I was making, but my studio was littered with these reproductions of Bronzino and Ang paintings, and my advisor, Amy Adler, was like, maybe one day you could like appropriate from one of these. And I was like, oh no, I don't think that's allowed. Could I, maybe? And so after I graduated, I was like all alone in my new little studio in LA, and I let myself do that.
What was the first appropriation?
It was Portrait of a Boy by Sargent.
Okay.
It's a really wonderful painting. His painting. But it felt really great to do it. I worked on it really slowly using these underpainting techniques that I'd sort of learned about, and painting like a grisaille underneath and then color on top. And I made this one painting very slowly over 6 months. And when I was done, I was like, oh yeah, it's related, but it's also its own thing. And I guess I can do this. No one's going to stop me. So.
But I think it's also interesting to think of Sargent, and I haven't seen the show at the Met yet. I'm excited to see the show. But thinking about like those thick impasto surfaces, and like there's a quickness of kind of gesture and brushstroke. What's been interesting to kind of live with the piece, and I also had a conversation with someone earlier tonight, is kind of like the impossible flatness of the painting. So can you talk also just a little bit like physical process of like making such a kind of flat, immaculate surface where you're really not looking at strokes, you're just kind of seeing image almost like in a filmic or photographic sense?
Yeah, I have this need to erase the hand while I'm working, so nothing is left visible. The work I made in graduate school was much more kind of realistic or photorealist, and that was one of the big breakthroughs for me. Was when I was working on this first painting, I drew it from it freehand. So as I've been drawing freehand from these sources, like with like a very loose grid, like that's when like the fingers started to tip up at the ends, and you know, the features became more kind of artificial and less realistic. So the one thing I do that I think is unusual is I don't mix medium into the paint. So the paint is very thick, which is probably counterintuitive, but it's kind of
like a linseed oil, or
linseed oil or turpentine or something like that. I did not realize this was weird until over time talking to more painters. But this is what I do. So it's like kind of toothpaste consistency, and I block it in, and then I blend it out with all these like very soft brushes. So, you know, it's like 10 hours to paint a face like one time, and I will do that 3 times. So the surface is also absorbent. So it's like a lead primed oil ground, which is a more traditional way of working, and it sucks everything in. So it also helps to flatten things and to give it that kind of smoothness. You know, some of it started with I just didn't like, if I changed the way I drew something, I didn't like that you could see like a tiny little ridge, you know? And so that became this obsession with flattening everything so that then I could redraw a hand if I needed to. And I don't know, here we are.
As a writer, it's interesting to kind of hear like an erasure of the hand. What do you think about that in terms of your own writing practice? Like, do you leave crumbs of the maker involved in it, or is it like, how do you approach? Well, okay, so this is also a combination. This is not the most beautifully formed question, but let's just go with it. Like, I often think about like mature style, or like coming to a spot where like you don't necessarily question the mode of getting there in the same way you may have at a different point in your life. So in terms of kind of painting and finding the way that you like working with paint and the flick of the hand and kind of the erasure of the artist's hand and the kind of making the piece, what is mature style, or what is a style that gives you confidence and maybe not to question how you move towards it? When does that come in? But also like, again, like how much of the writer do you want to be in the text? And you've done a lot with memoir and personal, so it's...
I mean, a thing people talk about a lot with writing is like voice, like this concept of like finding your voice or having a voice or a writer's voice. And I think for a long time I didn't really know what that meant. So like even when I applied to grad school, I wrote stories that I'm sure were like very technically accomplished. Like I was always like a good sort of sentence level writer, but like quickly in grad school I realized that I was like, I remember like having a kind of a mediocre workshop, my first one, and a person who is now a really good friend and a brilliant writer himself was like, you're really talented, but like you don't seem to care about what you're writing about. And he was totally right. He was absolutely correct. Because it was just, I wrote a story about a woman who's like, her father died and she had to go to his funeral. It was just, but I was like, this is what people write stories about, is like death, But there was this part in the story where death appears to her, like a figure in her hotel room, and then as she's flying back home, she's imagining death like running on the bottom of the ocean, like pursuing her. And everybody was like, this is the most interesting part of the story, is this like sort of surreal kind of magical, realist, whatever you would call it, kind of horror sequence. And so it was only when I began to realize that like that was actually what I was more interested in, was like that kind of, that mode, that I sort of locked into like what I needed to do. And so writing didn't feel as like random, whereas I feel like before it felt a little random. And I think that's normal. Like I think that's a normal place to start in when you're figuring out like, yeah, like what do I want to do? Because it's, so I always tell my students like voices, what do you want to say and how do you want to say it? So like at some point it's like, I know what I want to write about. Like I know my sort of interests and sort of this like, yeah, these like overlapping obsessions that I return to over and over. And then I also know that I'm really interested in like certain modes of storytelling. I'm really interested in like myths and fairy tales and urban legends. I'm really interested in like writing about sex. I'm really interested in the body. I'm really interested in like very luscious, precise sentences. Like I want the sentences to feel as dimensional as the story itself. So like I sort of just figured that out. And then, yeah, and I think you just get faster at it. Like you just, like in the beginning, I feel like it took me a long time to really get a story to where I wanted to go. And now I feel like I'm able, I mean, it's not that the work is like faster literally, but I know when I'm good, when I'm doing good. Like I literally be writing, I'll be like, this is great. Wow, I am here. Wow, I'm really like on fire right now, which is a great feeling. But like now I know it. Whereas like I feel like before I would be writing and I'd be like, I hope this is good. Like I hope. And I do actually remember like a moment in my writing when I always describe it as like, I don't know, you go to the gym every day and you like lift a certain amount of weight, and then one day you can lift a weight that's like slightly heavier than before. But there was this novella I wrote in grad school that's in my first book called Especially Heinous, and it's this like really surreal, I call it like a David Lynch style novella that takes the first 272 episodes of Law & Order SVU and uses their titles to build a totally alternate universe with Benson and Stabler, and there's like ghosts and doppelgangers and demons and like all this crazy shit. There are doppelgangers named Henson and Abler who are Benson and Stabler's doppelgangers, which actually came about because I mistyped one of their names, and I was like, oh, that'd be so funny, and then I just made them doppelgangers. But I was like writing it because I had like, it's not even, but like I basically had like, I had been reading through like capsule descriptions of episodes because I was trying to find a certain episode of that show, and I was like, who writes these like weird little blurbs on like IMDb or whatever that describes the episode? And then I just decided to like write like just alternate versions of them that like still dealt with like the questions of the show, like questions about sexual violence, but also like meta questions, like what does it mean to consume, that like the show that has now been on for 26 seasons is like about, is essentially like about sexual violence, and like that we have this endless, bottomless appetite for it. but I remember like when I was writing it, thinking this thought of like, am I allowed to do this? Like literally, like when you said that's like exactly the same. Where I was like, I don't, and I was like, am I plagiarizing? Like I was like, it was, and because I don't think that like, I think poets do this, but I don't think fiction writers, and I don't know if this is true in like visual art, like fiction writers do not talk a lot about influence and like how to manage the question of influence and like what it means to like look at a text and like adapt it or make it your own or be like this, you know, this is like my attempt to write something like this other story or this novel or whatever. Yeah, I feel like poets are better at talking about, there'll be like, you know, this poem is after so-and-so, or, you know, and then they just like, then they just do it. But I feel like fiction, it's like a little, we just don't talk about it as much. So yeah, so I feel like I was learning kind of on the fly, kind of how I was managing the input that was coming into me when I was like reading or watching something or whatever. And as a result, I feel like every time I'm doing anything, every time I encounter anything like as an art form, I am like sucking it into my, into my like, I'm like a vampire. I'm just like, all right, it's mine now. It's like up here and like it might pop out somewhere random, and it could be like visual art, it could be video games, movies, television shows, other novels, and I feel like I just figured out at some point like what the appetite was, and then like how you sort of make it your own. And I feel like in the beginning it was like almost like I didn't know if I could even do it, and then I realized I could, and then I just kept going, and no one stopped me. Like yeah, that's like nobody was like, everyone was like good job, and I was like all right, I'm just gonna keep doing this because everyone seems pleased. So.
Yeah, you get some positive feedback, and that helps you feel more secure. And you also mentioned like something by chance and recognizing that as a good direction to go. And that's sort of how I started with making the diptychs, because I always would make these drawings. That's like the first step in the process, is drawing these little rectangles on the paper and filling them in. And I cut them up and like put them on the wall, and I realized, oh, these are the same size, and when they're next to each other, they create a new image. They create a new body across this divide. Yeah, and so being able to recognize that when it happens, because you've been training your eye or your voice enough.
Yeah, I think I also, a lot of things that I have done that people are like, how did you think, it'll be like something that comes to me. So like also in that Law and Order story, there's the ghosts of the women who are murdered. They're ghosts and they have bells on their eye sockets and they communicate via Morse code, and they can't speak, they don't have mouths. And that came to me when I was shampooing my hair. I was like in the middle of washing it, and I took a break, and I was like standing in the shower, and I was like, oh, the ghosts should have bells in their eye sockets. I don't know where that came from. That was something in my subconscious just like kicked out this like really nightmarish image that was just, I instantly knew it was perfect. I had a little like, you can get like little waterproof pads for your shower. So I just literally like wrote down like ghosts with bells for eyes, got out, did all the rest of my things, got my hair into a towel, and then I like sat down and started writing. So like, I feel like also you train yourself to like, for your subconscious to like recognize when you've encountered something really interesting, or a subject that's really fascinating to you, or like a story that you understand that like, oh, I'm exactly where I need to be, and I actually do understand like what is sort of required of me for this particular project. But I always tell like students, it's like, you just learn how to do it. Like you don't know, and then at some point you do know.
Yeah, you have to work. You just have to
it's just the work.
Figure it out by working.
Yeah.
Like weird follow-up, like when they blink, do the bells ring? Like how
They don't blink.
Okay. Just bells.
They just bells in their eye sockets.
Okay.
I love them. That's one of my favorite subconscious moments, where something underneath just like gave me a freebie. So
it's a strange segue, but I'm gonna open it up. So if anyone has any questions, hey, come on.
I have a question for Carmen. You write a lot about like bodily sensations, like sex or food or body horror. I was wondering, like, what do you think draws you to writing about like the physical sensations of living, basically?
So I was diagnosed with OCD earlier this year, which made a lot of things make sense in my life. I was like, okay. And one of the sort of ways in which I knew this about myself, and I was like new to ask about it, was because I am hyper aware of like minute changes in my body at all times. And I've been this way my whole life. And it manifests as things like hypochondria, like severe anxiety, and as it turns out, it was, OCD. But so I think that I'm just really, I love sensation, I love pleasure. I'm very plugged into what I want. And then I think because I'm so able to like do this like very hyper sort of granular assessment kind of at all times, whether it's good or bad, I think I just am like naturally primed to be interested in these questions of what does it feel like? What is the sensation? And again, I feel like it's a thing that I also learned. So like something I wrote recently was I was chopping I was like cooking, I was chopping garlic, and you know how like when you chop garlic, like your fingers get kind of like that sticky kind of sensation, and I was like chopping, and I was like noticing it on my fingers, and then I was standing there at the board and just like looking at my hands, and I was like, oh, this is the same way, like this sensation is the same way that blood feels, like when blood is on your fingers, it has this exact same like slip and catch, like it was like exactly like there's supposed to be some like shared compound or something, and it was just because it was just like weird because I was just, my partner came into the room and I was just standing there like looking at my hand, and she was like, "Are you all right?" And I was like, "Yeah, I had to write something down, like I just had a thought, and so I think that like I just, again, like as part of the practice, and like eventually it's like I'm just doing it even while I'm not thinking about it. When I noticed, before I noticed, and then I had to stop and be like, what am I noticing? Oh, interesting. And then got to like write it down. So yes, I think it's just like hyper awareness in both good ways and bad ways of like what is happening in my body sort of in terms of sensation.
I have a question kind of about like psychological unraveling. I think about like Carmen, your story where you're like Yado, not Yado. And I feel like that character is unraveling and yet is so convinced like, no, I'm good though. And I feel like in this painting, like there's also a similar thing happening where it's like maybe the world around her is unraveling and like external circumstances might be unraveling, and even though she's processing it, like if we go back through the lens that we opened up with in this story, right, like she ultimately is okay. It's more like her having to process what's happening to her, but her herself, like she is sane. So I was kind of wondering if you all could talk to like how you dance around psychological unraveling, and like at what point do you either surrender or like choose to keep that boundary or that barrier intact, if that makes sense.
I think that working with images, talking about the psychological is challenging because a lot of my interest is in the original stories and the original images and the circumstances, and I'm interested in centering usually like the female character of these narratives that is usually just a catalyst but not really considered from a psychological perspective. But at the end of the day, like what you're going to have is a still image, and so a lot of it, I think, I focus a lot on making sure that it's visible how constructed the image is. I think there's a distance to it. It's not a naturalist image. It's hyper smooth, and the cropping, I think, serves to flatten the space and make it feel like a more constructed, inaccessible space. So I think of it as sort of like creating distance psychologically in a way, like what happens when you encounter trauma and you have to, compartmentalize it. Yeah, that's what I think about.
I have always been really interested in like questions of, what does it mean to unravel? What is sanity? I always think about how like there was this moment in history, actually we are still in the moment in history where like certain people observe and understand certain things about the world because of who they are, and other people are like, you're completely insane, like what are you talking about? and that and it's like the question of like who is actually the person who is like out of touch with like the situation in question. And so, like when the story that you referenced, The Resident, which is in my first book, I took an early version of it to a workshop with these like other sort of professional writers, and there was this writer there who was like an older woman, and she was like, the story is good, but like I just really tire of like mad women in the attic stories. I just don't have any appetite for like watching a woman fall apart on the page, which is like perfectly fair. Whatever, you have your own things you want to read about or not. But I was like kind of puzzled because I was like, well, but like I'm mentally ill and I am also a person with like dignity and like an interesting mind, and like I would want to read like a novella about somebody kind of like me, but like a slightly more tweaked, like just coming apart at a residency. Like that's actually really interesting to me, and I don't think that just because we have a queer female character who is like mad in some sense of the word or something akin to it, that story is not worth telling or that voice is not important or interesting. And I feel like there's this thing that's happening a lot right now. I don't really understand it from like a criticism perspective, where like people like understand things like tropes, but then they reject them wholesale. Like they're like, so like, they'll be like, well, then we can't have any stories about women coming apart because that's bad rep. That's like a bad stereotype, and we've had it for centuries and we can't have it anymore. So we should like get rid of it. And it's like, well, I'm actually way more interested in like taking it in and then like again like doing this process of thinking about like what does it mean that we have this story, what does it mean to have a character who looks like this, and so I think for me, and then as somebody who like also like my brain is like it's weird up here, right? And like I feel like so much of my life is trying to figure out like what is the balance of like my own internal turmoil, and I don't know, I also like grew up in a family where like I would just hear all the time like women are irrational, women are emotional, women don't, and took it really personally. And now that I'm older, I'm just kind of like, I'm actually really fascinated. It's like, well, if you want me to be irrational or emotional, I suppose I will be. I suppose I'm going to be completely psycho. And like, we'll see how that goes for you. So I actually, in a way, it's like a very interesting to me to like think about these questions kind of directly. And so, yeah, I am really interested in like bad behavior from characters who are not supposed to be bad. And just like leaning into me, like, okay, if that's what you think, then we're gonna roll with that. So, yeah, I don't know. So that to me, so I think I have a lot of characters that are like a little bit. I feel like that's a common character that I write because it's just like kind of a version of me in a certain way. I'm like, what would happen if I had this kind of mental breakdown in this space, and then I write it. So,
I think we have time for one more, just in case. In the back.
I just have a question. I'm very, very curious about people who are creative in your creative process. If you guys could each maybe take a few observations of yourself, like what's your workday like? Do you have habits to get started? Do you work every day? Do you work for hours at a time? I'm just always really curious about the creative process with creative people.
Friday kind of painter generally, and then sometimes on the weekends. But painting, like, it's like a long day. You have to mix up all the colors and then paint the whole thing while it's wet. So, like I said, I would do a face or something like that. Like, that's what I'm going to do that day. Things are painted in sections, and so it's all kind of very programmed. But yeah, I get there at 8 a.m. and...
Technically, so if we're looking at the background right now and the kind of flatness and the consistency of the color, is that all done in one sitting, or is that color mixed again and again to be the exact same on each piece?
You're talking about the skin or the
backgrounds?
Black? The black, yeah. That's like one painting is painted at one time.
Okay.
Yeah. And then another one on another day.
Okay.
But yeah, the black is like a recipe.
Yeah.
You weigh it out with like grams and the whole thing. Yeah. Yeah,
because I think of like dye lots and yarn that if it could be the same color, but if you get a different time, you get a different result. So I imagine for the consistency of going across 3 canvases, I'm interested in the recipe. Yeah,
there's a recipe and it like it's mixed up and I put it in a tube and then like add medium to it and then but yeah, and so it's hard for me, like I can't get anything done in like 3 hours. I need like a full day to do things, and things are sort of, I count things in days. So I'm like, okay, that painting is going to take 36 days or whatever it is. But mostly I'm painting, and then I'm also like I go into periods of like research and drawing where I'm trying to figure out what will the next show be and what will the next project look like. And I'll go to arts libraries at universities, I'll go to museums and see shows, take pictures, make drawings, Google things.
Do you listen to anything while you paint?
I mostly listen to like audiobooks and podcasts and stuff, but also music.
It's funny, my partner is also a visual artist, and she's like, when you're done working for the day, you just turn off your computer. I have to clean up, and it takes like an hour, and it's like, and I was like, oh yeah, that's true. I guess I don't have to clean up at all, which is kind of nice. But yeah, so I am also, I've gone through several like creative phases. I actually had a whole different process pre-COVID, and then like quarantine and lockdown really like altered my relationship with like time and the day in this way that I am still kind of adjusting to. And so I am similarly, I also am kind of like a Monday through Friday, like I treat it like a job. The problem with it is that I also do a lot of other things. Like I'm not just doing my own projects. I'm also like writing, freelance projects for various jobs that I have, where I also teach, and so, or I'll have like something else that I'm doing. And so I have to kind of create these spaces, because I also like don't want to jump into a project. I can't write for like an hour on a creative project of my own, because then I feel, and then I have to go to the dentist or go do some other task or work on something else. So I tend to like kind of big chunks of time where I can work. So I tend to work in these kind of like bursts. And then I treat myself, I cook at the end of the day, and it's like I want to, because it's like I want to do a creative thing that is not staring at my computer and not thinking about words, and it's like almost like a different creative practice of like being, and also that uses my body and like uses space in this way that like being at the computer doesn't, and writing doesn't really. And I also do a lot of like what I call passive writing, which is like I'm constantly getting ideas and I become excellent at just catching them. So like a common thing that happens is I'll be driving and I'll get an idea, and I'll tell my partner, I'll be like, text me, and she'll pull out her phone, and I'll just be like, okay, I'm gonna say a sentence, and I'll just like say some like weird nonsense sentence or like an image or something, and she'll just like dutifully like type it in and like text it to me, so I have a copy of it. Or I like record myself a lot, and I have like a sort of way of like, it doesn't matter what the software is, but I have a software called Evernote, which is just like good note-taking sort of annotation software, and I just have like various folders, and I'll open up a folder and be like, okay, this project, I just had an idea for this, and I'll put it in here. So oftentimes when I sit down to write, where I'm like writing scenes or writing pages, there's actually a lot of work that's been done already, and I'm just kind of like, it's like my brain's been writing the story in fragments out of order for like a month or something, and then I'm sort of like putting them together and then like connecting them and figuring out what the connective tissue is between them. So that is actually, I actually do a lot of writing. Like I'm working on a novel now, and I haven't done any writing per se, but I have probably like 20,000 words written, and a lot of like outline material, and it's just from me like reading and then taking some notes, or like opening a document and popping in some like sentences or ideas or whatever. It's this weird like, but I think also treating it like a 9 to 5. I don't like write all night. Occasionally I'll have like ideas all night, and then I'll wake up constantly and be like writing things down for the next day. But and on the weekends I want to like garden or like play a video game or like do something more chill. Because writing is actually quite intense. It's nice to have a little break. So.
All right, well, Jesse and Carmen, thank you so much for tonight. Thank you
Thank
everyone
you.
for joining us. Stick around.